Hi everyone, I'm Heather Martin and I'm here with Lee Child, a man who needs no introduction, for the Rayworth's Harrogate Literature Festival as part of Harrogate International Festivals. We'll be talking about Lee's life in the context of my biography, The Reacher Guide, there it is behind me, which came out a couple of weeks ago. But first, I'd like to thank Rayworth's solicitors of Harrogate for sponsoring the festival, as they have done now for a number of years. And since all of this year's virtual events are being offered free to view, encourage those of you who can to donate to the cause so that we can all look forward to many more such wonderful festivals in the future. Lee, would you like to say a few words before we start and maybe kick things off then by talking a little bit about your own association with Harrogate festivals over the years?
Yeah, hi Heather, I'm Lee Child, and I want to echo everything Heather just said about the people up in Harrogate, specifically the sponsors and organizers of this festival, but also generally. It's a wonderful culture up there. They got a lot of different things running with the support of a lot of different people. And we are all most grateful for that. And we would love to see it continue. So as Heather said, this is a horrible, odd year for people in the festival business. So help them out, contribute a little bit, and hopefully next year we'll be back to normal, or the year after, or whenever. But we got to keep the faith. So support Harrogate in any way you can. It's a lovely town. I've been there for mainly the Theakston's Crime Writing Festival a number of times. I really can't remember how many times. And it is one of the real nicest festivals of anywhere in the world. I might even go as far as to say it is the best, because it has a couple of unique features to it that maybe are to do with Harrogate. Maybe it's the Harrogate zeitgeist that informs the festivals. But the Crime Writing Festival usually has great weather, which is a good start because it's a sort of indoor-outdoor thing where all the events are inside the hotel, but there's a huge garden where people congregate and have fun and meet and talk, and that's really the nice part of it. So I've been there, I can't remember how many times, but a lot. And one year I was the programming director, and I've always just had the best time. So, support Harrogate this year. Keep it in mind for next year when life returns to normal, and come and see us all.
Lee's history with Harrogate goes back much further than mine, but the city is important to the history of the biography too. I first met Lee at an auspicious moment for a biographer, at the height of his success, but also at the critical moment where his stature was being recognized and acknowledged beyond the crime writing community. He was doing keynotes at Oxford and Cambridge. He was attracting attention from the London Review of Books and the Times Literary Supplement. He was writing brilliant essays for the New Yorker and the New York Times. No surprise that a CBE for services to literature followed a few years later. And my first visit to Harrogate was in fact to see him collect a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Theakston Old Peculiar Crime Festival. And I'd just come from New York, where he'd been elected Thriller Master by the International Thriller Writers Association at Thrillerfest. This is all in 2017. And by then we'd kind of tentatively agreed the idea of a biography, but it was during that visit to Harrogate that I found my beginning, or rather on a visit to the nearby market town of Otley. Lee will tell you that he didn't want a biography. He's told lots of other people that, and I'm sure he'll tell you that. Not at first, anyway. But I'm not so sure, because from the moment we met, he was telling me stories, in brief, in passing, about the length of a text or a short email. But they sort of tantalized, they teased, they had me hooked and wanting more. Exactly the experience of the average Reacher reader, which of course is exactly what I was. And one of those stories was about Otley. It was when I asked about his name, James D. Grant. What does the D stand for, I wanted to know. And at that point in history, that detail wasn't included on Wikipedia. That came along with the CBE. And he answered, he said, Dover. But he didn't just say that. He added, for my maternal grandfather, the only real human among my immediate ancestors, drank a little, gambled a little, smoked a lot. I mean, I never forgot those, I think, 25 words. And it turned out that Harry Dover Scrafton was from Otley. And so that time we were both together at Harrogate at the festival, I told Lee one day that I was planning to go to Otley for the day to sort of, explore the place where he'd spent his childhood holidays. And he said, again, sowing all kinds of seeds, make sure you visit the library. I read a lot of books there. Okay, simple statement, but definitely an imperative. So yeah, I think that deep down inside him, there was a biography waiting, just sort of lying in wait for a biographer. And I'm kind of glad that I was the one to spot it, lurking there. So I found my first chapter in Otley, where Lee had told me he'd spent the happiest moments of his childhood. And I'm going to begin today by asking Lee about a photograph of Harry Dover Scrafton, who lived in Otley. Actually, it's a photograph. These are all photographs that are in the biography, and I'm just taking a few as starting points for our conversation today. It's actually a photograph of the 3-year-old James seated between his two grandfathers on a bench. We'll come to the Irish side of the family next. And in a way, you've seen a photograph like that thousands of times before. It's Lee Child flanked by 2 adoring fans. But on the other hand, you've never seen one quite like this, and I doubt there's another in existence, because it's the only one that I know of where he's the shortest of the 3, and his feet don't even reach the ground. So Lee, can you tell us, please, about Harry, about Audrey, his wife, and about Otley, and the influence of the 3 of you, the 3 of those on you growing up?
Sure. I mean, it was the family originally was from the northeast, South Shields in County Durham, and my granddad, Harry Dover, was one of, I believe, 10 children.
Wow.
And I believe, nobody really ever talked about it, because you've got to understand from the start, everybody should understand that my family talked about virtually nothing. And it was as if there was a list of things that must not be talked about. And at the top of the list was the list itself, so that nothing was ever really revealed or discussed. So it was all very pieced together, almost in a kind of archaeological fashion. So what happened, Harry was a poor boy, one of 10, but he had a facility for drawing and designing. He was a good technical drawer, a fairly good artist generally, but excellent at representing physical form with pencil and paper. And the family story is that he was going nowhere. He would have presumably ended up with some menial job. But one day when he was about 13 or 14, the local duchess, some kind of aristocratic visit to his school. I don't know why, or I guess back in those days, this would have been during the First World War. The Duke and Duchess of wherever did a state visit to his school, and the Duchess allegedly, according to the family legend, saw his work, saw these drawings, and somehow from that moment on pulled strings or recommended him or spoke to a friend. And he ended up doing an apprenticeship as a naval draftsman at one of the big shipyards on the Tyne. And he did very well at it, because like I say, he was a small, neat guy who could translate 3D thinking in his head onto the page. So he became quite a promising naval draftsman, designing ships. In the drawing office, you've probably seen documentary coverage or pictures, this vast office the size of an aircraft hangar with probably 50 desks, with 50 guys bent over these desks with big pieces of paper and T-squares and all that kind of thing. And so he was set, basically, because of the lucky intervention by the alleged Duchess, he was set. Except, of course, then the Wall Street crash happened and the Depression started, and all of those shipyards went bankrupt. So he was out of work in the early 30s. And he found another job with the what was called the GPO, the General Post Office, their telephone division, GPO telephones. He was given a job with them with one problem, that the job was not actually open yet. This was going to be a job in the drawing office, designing things like telecommunication masts and things like that. Again, structures that needed form and strength. And so he was told, yeah, you can have this job in the drawing office when it becomes available. And in the meantime, you can work on the road crew, which meant digging ditches for burying telecoms cables. And that temporary arrangement lasted for 5 years. So for 5 years, he was a ditch digger for the post office. And then eventually, this magical job opened up, and he moved to Otley because that's where there was a GPO school in Otley and a big drawing office. And so he moved there to start that job late in the 1930s. And from that point on became a Yorkshireman. I only ever knew him as somebody who lived in Yorkshire. I do wonder, you know, it was a traumatic move, I think, for all of them to an extent. Don't forget, Britain back then was very parochial, very isolated. To move from the northeast to Yorkshire, it's not much now. I'm sure people do that all the time, but back then it seemed like a big upheaval. And my mother was yanked out of school. She had started grammar school and completed her first year and was pulled out of that and had to go to the Otley school, which was really no worse, I think, but, you know, traumatic for a kid of that age. So in general, they arrived in Otley in a little bit of disarray. But they settled there pretty well. Harry he was just too young for World War I and just too old for World War II. Also with this telecommunications job, it would have been regarded as reserved employment. So he was not called up, but he became a volunteer fire watcher, firefighter, all that kind of thing. My grandmother went to work in war production factories straight away. And one of this is probably, I may have told you this privately, but this is one of the huge scandals in my family, that my grandma worked sort of 5 or 6 years during World War II. And then, of course, in the general way of things, stopped, you know, because as you know, post-war, all the soldiers came home. There was another big shift in employment where the women factory workers were dismissed and the men took their places. So my grandmother went back to being a regular housewife in 1945. But due to some bureaucratic snafu, her national insurance record was not altered. It ran on for the rest of her life as if she was still contributing, which left them with a huge ethical dilemma, because when she reached the age of 60, which was the women's pension age during her lifetime, when she reached that age, she claimed her pension thinking she was going to get a very modest amount relating to those 5 years of wartime work. But actually, she got a full pension because they believed she'd been working for 20 plus years. And it's a huge ethical dilemma. Should she take it or should she not? And she did. So, you know, that's our financial scandal in the family.
Cool. Let's move on to your Irish family. On the same page in the biography, there's a photograph of you with your older brother and your parents, younger two not yet born. You're about 2.5. And you're at the mill where you're somewhere around Belfast, where your great-grandparents used to work. And the things that stuck with me about your great-grandparents, your great-grandfather was illiterate, but your great-grandmother not, which was interesting. And your grandfather was their seventh son, the youngest of their 7 children, John, no middle name Grant, very important detail. And he was the first in the family ever to go to school. And of course, he served in the First World War. Tell me a little bit about that side of the family and the times that you visited Belfast as a child. And perhaps also why you felt more comfortable with the Scraftons than the Grants.
Well, if you look at that photograph, you know, me as the little angelic kid sitting between the two of them, I often wondered, and I often kind of sensed a slight tension between those two grandfathers, in the sense that my Irish grandfather, my father's father, was 12 years older. And, you know, that's a significant slice of years, even at grandfather type age. And my Irish grandfather had fought in World War I and had been wounded. And I think that in my mother's father's eyes, in Harry's eyes, I think there was a measure of slight inadequacy about it, because as I said, he'd missed both wars through being the wrong age. And I feel that, you know, that was tough on men that were not involved when they were face to face with men who had been involved, who were also considerably more than a decade older. So I think there was some slight tension there. Plus, my Irish family, my father's parents, were very strictly uptight in a sort of Calvinist, Puritan kind of a way. There was numerous things wrong that people could do. And on top of that list, the worst thing anybody could do was enjoy themselves or have fun. And so it was a difficult, dour, rather stern atmosphere with the Irish parents, which only highlighted actually how comparatively loose and fun my other grandparents were. You know, as you said at the beginning, in that email to you, I said he drank a little, gambled a little, and smoked a lot. Well, you know, the drinking was, he would have a couple of bottles of pale ale on a Friday after work. And the gambling was any of the big festivals, the Grand National or Cheltenham or something like that, he would have a flutter, you know, half a crown or 5 bob or something like that.
Different stuff, really.
Yeah, very modest, very token, but still utterly disapproved of on the other side of the family.
Okay, so I can see how you were having more fun with your Otley grandfather, and of course it was your Otley grandmother who took you to the library a lot when you were very young, which was very important. Rewinding to the very first picture I've got of you in the biography, it's, you know, you're not much more than a babe in arms, really, but you are sitting up, and you're absolutely beaming, you know, radiating light from the page. And I remember when you first showed me that photograph, you said, "I look at that happy little boy and wonder what became of him." Poignant and rather moving words, and reminded me at the time of another very memorable line of yours from the piece you'd recently written in the New York Times about, you were looking back on the moment when you first became #1 in America. And you said, unforgettably, "I was depressed at 8, but fine by 9. Fine, perhaps, but still not quite, and perhaps never again, that beaming little boy. If you look at the pictures of you as a schoolboy, all through the school years, you're serious, thoughtful, I mean, at best melancholy, you know, with a look that suggests you're somewhere in some far distant place in your own mind. And I remember your best friend at 6th form, when I interviewed him, saying to me that, you know, obviously you'd had loads of fun together, wild times and all that, but he recalled a look of sadness in your eyes. So tell us about that early encounter with doom and gloom in 1950s and 1960s Birmingham.
Well, I mean, it's something that is hard to talk about because partly, one isn't aware at the time of certain things, certain processes happening. But most of all, because I definitely do not want to in any way imply that I had a difficult or miserable childhood. Absolutely not. I mean, that would be an outrageous claim in the face of people that really do have
Yeah.
bad childhoods. We were never hungry. We were always clothed. We had leather shoes, which was a talisman at the time. There were some kids who had plastic beach shoes as opposed to leather shoes. That was we were fine. We were not in any way deprived or abused. But on the other hand, I do look back and I do have this memory of being, when I was sort of very young, 3, 4, 5, up to maybe 6 or so, I do remember being a very happy person. And the photographs poignantly and nostalgically remind me of that. There's this beaming, smiling kid with wide, shining eyes. And I kind of remember being like that. And then I think, in particular, with looking at it from within my own family, it was a dour, repressed, rather miserable cult. I've read books subsequently about people who've grown up in religious cults and then escaped. And it's very reminiscent. There was no religion involved. I mean, this was not in any way theologically based, other than the religion was that middle-class respectability that people at that time, certain people at that time, just pursued manically. And so our family was dedicated to the pursuit of middle-class respectability, which meant it was very gray, repressed, everything was deferred. And I guess looking back, I can reconstruct an awareness of just constantly knocking into things, not only in the family, but in the real world as well, just constantly being stonewalled by one thing after another, school, family, everything. And that just sort of, I feel like it crushed that happy-go-lucky spirit that I remember having. And I did. I became reserved, very introverted, and the difference between me at 5 and the difference between me and 8 was drastic.
Wasn't it a kind of generalized post-war thing as well that you were experiencing? So not just you felt it was a generational thing a bit as well?
I did. I mean, it's fascinating to me that that period for the conflict between those two generations, because first of all, World War II in England had been such a massive thing. I mean, as we know, historically, factually, in every way, it was easily, obviously, the greatest event of the 20th century, and maybe one of the most fundamental conflicts in all of human history. And the British people had endured it, survived it, and won. And so we had, as little kids, we had this sensation that history was behind us. The massive thing had already happened, that looking ahead was nothing other than what we had now. And the culture was saturated with it. Every book, every film, everything was always about World War II. And the conflict was pretty obvious. I didn't really sort of reflect on it until later, but you had this generation that genuinely had suffered very badly. When I was born in 1954, my parents for 20 solid years had lived hard, miserable lives. First of all, the Depression. Then World War II with rationing, minor details, like my mother from the age of about 13 to 19, in other words, her teenage years, she never had a new pair of shoes. They were all secondhand, passed down from relatives and so on. So they'd had this long, miserable, dour 2 decades. And they wanted to feel they'd achieved something that was in their own image. And so that not just my family, but everybody's family, society as a whole had this kind of catchphrase from the parent generation that said, we didn't fight the war for the likes of this. And, you know, that was an unanswerable thing, except that later you started to intellectualize it and you would have to say, well, yes, you did. You fought for freedom. And this is what freedom looks like.
Yeah.
Because we were the very first generation ever in history. My specific generation was the very first in history that had no problems.
Yeah.
You know, we had no diseases. We had welfare state. We had free education. We had a liberal post-war Western democracy. We had everything taken care of, no burdens. You know, we didn't get called up. We didn't have to go to war. In Britain, we even escaped Vietnam. So that we were a gilded generation. And the tension was palpable that our parents, I guess, were a little resentful, but mainly jealous. You know, we had something that was so beautiful compared with what they had.
Yeah, that's a great account. And it hooks up beautifully with my next question, which is 3 different photographs from your boyhood years. One of you in football kit with your foot on a leather football, right foot on a leather football, and one of your drama teacher from King Edward's School conducting a rehearsal, and the third of the same best friend I mentioned earlier playing his guitar. Sort of 3 pictures, 3 formative moments: football, theatre, music. What did those things have in common for you when you were growing up, and why did they matter so much? And I'm pretty sure it's connected to what you were just talking about.
Well, I mean, the football, I don't know what that was about, because I really wasn't very good at it. You know, that needs to be said right away, that I did play for my primary school team, Cherry Orchard, but not every game. And looking back on it, there was a certain amount of charity involved by the teacher who would, you know, if somebody else was not available or something, he'd think, oh, all right, put him in, you know. So there was a certain amount of tolerance about it, and I wasn't really very good at it, but I loved it. And why did I love it? I think because it was an antidote to isolation and loneliness. In other words, I was cooperating with 10 other kids. We were playing a team game, and to be part of a team was a lovely thing. And the theatre.
Same with theatre, I guess. In a way.
Yeah, well, theatre, I was not participating yet. If we're talking about watching it, then I would just be an audience member. But I was, as an audience member, very aware of the transaction going on, the two-way communication between the stage and the audience. Again, you were part of something that was larger than yourself and somehow secret, because yeah, there might be 1,000 people in the audience, but those were all the people that it was happening to at the time. So that was very influential. And again, music, yeah, you know, music, as you know, I'm not very good at it, but I love the idea of being in a group and collaborating with other people to make something. And, you know, I'm really not a musician, but I'm close enough to possibly being one to feel that joy of, you know, 4 or 5 people making music together. If it goes right for a minute, you know, that's just a wonderful transformational feeling.
And I guess they were all kind of means of escape for you as well, from that sort of family life that you were describing, and that sort of rather dour existence. Then they all represented the possibility of escape, and particularly when you discovered the Beatles, which was, I think you were aged.
Yeah,
that was transformational, wasn't it?
It was. If it comes right down to it, it was all about escape, even though we might not articulate it to ourselves. But I've read over the years lots of memoirs or biographies by, the pop stars of the 60s or whatever. And they all have that same thread, that they are abandoned or feel abandoned in some dismal part of grey Britain. They're frustrated and they want to break out, they want to escape. And we all felt that to some extent. And I remember, as you said, I was depressed at 8, but fine at 9, because the thing that happened between 8 and 9 was the Beatles. And for me, it was literally transformational. It was, I remember we were having a miserable summer holiday somewhere, Wales, I'm sure, in a caravan, lashing rain and howling wind and all of that, and this fractious, boring family. And so at one point I went to sit in the car, which was an old fourth-hand Rover 90. And I turned on the radio, and it was an old tube radio, valves in UK terms. So it warmed up slowly with sort of spitting, hissing sound. And then the first thing I heard, it was Saturday Club with Brian Matthews on the BBC Light program, as it was called then. And it warmed up, and out of the ether came the words, and here it is, the new one from the Beatles, 23rd of August, 1963. She Loves You. And, it has an opening, Ringo in the opening, it's about 11 seconds long. And it totally changed my life. I suddenly thought, it just hit the spot at exactly the right moment, that there was something for us, full of joy, full of excitement, full of love. And, looking back on it, obviously that's utterly trivial compared to fighting a war or beating a depression, but I felt, that, our generation, there is future for our generation. And my life utterly changed in that 11 seconds. I felt, I have an appetite for things. There is something I'm going to enjoy. And boy, did I. I mean, from the next 10 years, let's say, from the summer of 63 to the summer of 73, I mean, what a cornucopia of great music, unbelievable experiences. It was, those 10 years were just, culturally, globally incandescent.
You spent a number of those years, though, at school, nevertheless. I think you're talking about beyond school there. And at school, you either had to win or you didn't give a damn, basically. And you were a bit of a conundrum to your teachers. So side by side in the biography, I've got detention cards for persistently unsatisfactory behaviour and cutting school, probably to head off to some music festival somewhere. And the front cover of your remarkably erudite 60-page essay on the Anglo-Saxons that won you the Medieval History Prize. So you're kind of like either top of the class or flirting with failure. And that was, right across the board in all subjects, because you were also a bit of a polymath, as strong in maths and physics as you were in English, history and Latin, or at least, when you chose to be. So tell us a bit about your experience of secondary school and how your aptitudes and your attitude are reflected in Reacher. We haven't mentioned him yet.
No, well, I mean, the school thing was, I was sort of painfully literal and earnest as a kid, and I noticed things that were just intellectually incongruent. I mean, for instance, to go back to Harry Dover for a moment, he was a guy who cleaved to that old-fashioned message. You see, his apprenticeship and his further qualifications before he lost his job were very heavily based on going to the Mechanics Institute in the evening, night school and all that kind of thing. And his message to us as kids was work hard at your education and you'll be okay. A very traditional message. But of course, I was thinking, as this forensic kid, I was thinking, well, wait a minute. You worked hard and you went to night school and you did all that good stuff, but you lost your job anyway, and you spent 5 years digging ditches. So that clearly is not a true connection. That education does not, in fact, guarantee you a good job. And so I found that troublesome. And also the school itself, King Edward's School, was a very, one of those very ancient foundations and very competitive to get in. But you had to do an entrance exam to get in. And it was pretty difficult, to be honest. The attrition rate was enormous. Probably 1 out of every 200 applicants would pass the exam. And the exam itself, I remember it well. It was basically an IQ test and a general knowledge test with some little investigations into your maybe creativity. And so that's the basis on which I got in, IQ and general knowledge, which was meat and drink to me. At the age of 10, I had fantastic general knowledge and a decent IQ. So I murdered the test completely, expecting this. I mean, literally, I probably scored 98%. I mean, looking back on it after the exam, I knew I'd nailed it. So I thought, great, I'm getting into a school where IQ and general knowledge do the business. So I show up to the first day, and it's a complete bait and switch. It's got nothing to do with IQ or general knowledge. It's all about classic academics, Greek, Latin, all this kind of stuff, with a very heavy kind of Oxford University-based prejudice against modernity, against anything basically that happened after the year 1485. The idea being that if you can speak and read Latin and ancient Greek, then you're set for life, and all the rest is just detail. And I felt like, that's not what I want to do. I wanted practical things that you can solve by brain work, or you can make through handiwork. That's what I wanted, and that's what I thought it was going to be. So when I got there and found out that it wasn't that, I dabbled. Some of it was great. Some of it was really, really interesting. And I paid attention and did very well. Some of it was just utterly distasteful, like chemistry. I thought, it's a horrible, smelly, damp sort of subject. So I literally paid no attention to chemistry and didn't even go and take my O-level for it. So, I was a total dilettante about it. I picked and chose. It was like a cafeteria to me. Some of it I loved, some of it I completely ignored.
And that's kind of that emphasis on the practical knowledge is, of course, what distinguishes Richard from his brother Joe, isn't it? And also, I remember you saying something to me like, basically it's either 100% or 60%. Nothing in between, that Richard will always do enough to pass the exam when he's a kid at school. Just enough to pass, so he'll get full marks. And that's describing you, isn't it, at King Edward's?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If you needed 51% to pass the exam, then to push yourself to 52% is a waste of effort. Yeah. Unless you happened to enjoy the subject.
Yeah.
Whereupon I would score 100%, because not to impress the teacher, I couldn't care less about that. It was just that I enjoyed the subject, and to actually murder an exam was satisfying in itself.
So there's a kind of real authenticity there in your attitude, actually, and an integrity, one has to say, though it must have driven your teachers mad. I want to move on to your working life, because I've got a wonderful photograph of you with your best friend at Granada Television. You spent 18 years working there, and your best friend, Rob Reeves, taken by a mutual friend. And I'm pretty sure I'm right. Well, neither of you seem to recall having seen that photograph before, and I came up with it. And I remember when I showed it to Rob, he said, "You can see the closeness between us." And when I showed it to you, you said, look at the difference in our eyes. And from your point of view, his expression was open and untroubled, and yours was kind of watchful and guarded. And I was fascinated by that, and still am really, partly because there's a strong emphasis on eyes in your writing, and the way Reacher relates to other people. Eyes often come up. And partly because I discovered in doing the biography that the word guarded, was quite significant. And you've kind of touched on it already. I remember when I met your drama and English teacher from King Edward's, and he told me about when he'd met you again as Lee Child, and that you had impressed him, and I quote, as a man of great honesty and self-awareness, but guarded. And then I read Night School, and at the point where everyone's second favourite character, Frances Nagley, is introduced, she's described as Reacher's best friend, possibly, in a guarded way, if friendship was the permission to leave things unsaid. So can you tell us a bit about that guardedness and your friendship with Rob, and those, to you, I think, defining essential differences between the two of you? And again, it goes back to your upbringing, your respective backgrounds, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Rob and I were, for those several years that we were together at Granada, we're just the best of friends. And I'm not sure that I've ever met a person who would ever occupy his spot in my life. That he was just a fascinating guy, partly because we were so different, I think. Different people, but also in different circumstances. But we started there together, more or less, within a couple of weeks of each other, and in the same training for the same level of job. And this was the year 1977 in Manchester. And again, looking back on it, 77 to me feels like yesterday, but actually it is a long time ago. We're talking over 40 years ago, when Manchester was very different. Again, still England was parochial. The apparent distance between places was immense. Cultures were very distinctive. And Manchester in 1977 was still like the industrial north of England in the 19th century. Almost literally, it felt like that. And so Rob had come up from the south. Basically, he was a Surrey boy. And I was only from the Midlands, but even so, we felt totally in an alien environment. And that caused us to kind of stick together. We were partly bemused by it, partly horrified by it, and of course you had to watch out what you said to the Mancunians. We bonded over the unfamiliarity of being there. And very quickly we found we had fun together. We had a lot in common, a lot not in common, but there was just that spark where, I mean, literally, we would work together for 8 or 12 hours at a time. And it would be just a non-stop joke fest and, deep into fantasy conversations that would just continue. And Rob was the kind of person, I mean, literally, I saw him a few years ago for the first time in many years. And it's one of those friendships where instantly, within a split second, you're familiar with one another again, and you're back to the old banter and the old jokes and all that kind of thing. So, yeah, Rob was huge in my life, just a joy to know and hang out with.
That point about him being untroubled and open, for you, strongly, so that was a difference between you, and you associated it with him being a Southerner and the sort of class and regional differences that, in your view, pretty much shaped your whole life.
Yeah, I mean, class and regional differences and also family differences. I mean, he had a sort of boisterous, energetic, fun set of parents who I'm sure they were vastly imperfect. In fact, they sound a bit sort of rackety and kind of unreliable, to be honest, but they were fun. They were enablers, that they encouraged him. And so he came with a certain amount of openness and optimism that had long been scoured out of me. So that's where the guarded thing comes from. I mean, it's probably reading way too much into an old black and white photograph, but I look at Rob's eyes and I see, here's a guy who's looking forward with optimism. You know, what is the next great thing? And I look at my eyes and I see a guarded look saying, how am I going to be betrayed next? Mm-hmm. How am I going to be disappointed next? Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's the difference I see, and that's the difference I felt.
Cool, thank you. And just sticking with Granada for a bit, sort of next up, I've got your ID card from Granada Television. Great picture. Yeah, it's the era of the beard and the moustache. And you started there, like Rob, as an assistant transmission controller, then a transmission controller, then senior presentation director. And as I understand it, those are all pretty much variations on a theme. But you excelled at your job. There was 100% consensus on this from your former colleagues. They kept using phrases like grace under pressure. You were sort of affectionately nicknamed the judge, the controller, and on a really big day, the word of God. So tell us a bit about that job. And also, I think specifically would be really interesting for people, how that impacted on your confidence, what it did for your confidence, and how that fed into early negotiations with your agent and publisher when, much further down the road, you switched careers.
Well, the job at Granada is really difficult to describe, but it was, the way I usually say it, it was like an air traffic controller of the network. So that, you know, ITV in those days was, had at any one time 14 stations on the air, all feeding in and taking out and dipping in, dipping out of the network feed, which had to be timed to the split second. From opening to closing, everything was timed to the second, everything had to be right. So it was simultaneously an administrative job, operational, editorial, all of those things. And when you had the senior job, the transmission controller, you had to ensure the smooth running, which was difficult enough. There were approximately 15,000 separate items a day that had to be the right item in the right order at the right time. So running normally, it was hard enough. And then your job was, if anything went wrong, you had to cope with it. And the things going wrong could be equipment failures or whatever, but most usually things like news bulletins needing to be inserted or news flashes and things of this nature. It was just a constant rolling kind of panic situation that you had to organize your way through. And yeah, you know, in Granada's terms, the stakes were incredibly high because it was all about commercial revenue, obviously. And back then, I suppose that pound quantities wouldn't seem that impressive compared to today because of inflation and so on. But it was an immense amount of money every single day that had to be earned and guaranteed. So the pressure was extremely high. Except I sort of thought, well, no, it isn't really. You know, nobody dies. Nobody's going to be, this isn't all that serious. And so I never panicked in that sense. You know, I never thought my life is on the line here. The worst that could happen is I could screw something up and be called on the carpet the next day. And because you had that kind of confidence and not worrying too much about it, I never did screw it up. It was all fairly easy and self-explanatory. And I've never been much for drama in the sense that, you know, you can have some thing occur and you can either tear your hair out and shout and scream for a bit and then solve the problem. But what I used to do is just look up from the newspaper and tell people what to do, because why bother with the preamble?
And that's basically carried over, didn't it, to sort of cut to the chase there on when you were negotiating things with your publisher, even, you know, as a complete novice in that game when you first met your publishers for Killing Floor, you had that kind of confidence that that you could make things work and, you know, no fuss, no drama.
Simply because of the comparative size of audience and also the comparative speed with which you got the feedback. because in television, everything is reviewed the next morning, basically in the papers and so on. And the audiences are gigantic. You know, back then we would do Coronation Street or whatever, and it could have an audience of 26 million people in Britain alone. And, you know, best will in the world, I don't sell 26 million copies of each book. So the scale, the publishing scale seemed very manageable to me. And the publishing people were nice people. You know, they were very smart and very good at being publishers, but part of being a publisher is being nice. And so after dealing for 20 years with these absolute bastards at Granada in management, especially later on when I was shop steward, where some of those arguments and some of those issues were, you know, immense in terms of people's livelihoods. Dealing with the publishing business seemed very straightforward. And so everything for me is based on what the audience wants. And I knew by that point, I knew exactly what the audience was and how it would react. And so negotiations in publishing were comparatively very pleasant and very straightforward.
There you go. That's a great, thank you. That's a great account. I'm going to squeeze in one more quick question before we finish. I want to skip to the final photograph that I've got in the biography, which is one I took of you in your apartment in Manhattan, where you are right now. You're reading a book, like you usually are, if you're not writing or giving interviews or maybe listening to music, and you're on the sofa, which is where you're usually to be found, like now, but unusually you're framed framed by and reflected in a rather beautiful mirror surrounded by photographs of your family. And I think that photograph says a lot about you. I remember you once told me that your desire was always to be shown with something between you and the viewer. I wonder if you could just explore that very briefly for us, those words, because those words, again, so intriguing. It's the point I started out with. You say things, they stuck with me. I kept coming back to them, the little stories. And I think those words partly explain why The Reacher Guy is a biography and not an autobiography.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right, that I need it. I would never do an autobiography. I would need it filtered through somebody else. And really the photography thing was a theory I came up with about author photographs, that, I mean, what is the exact relationship between the book and the author? The book is the thing that's in the marketplace, and the author is at some distance behind it. So for author photographs, I wanted to have some distance between the person looking at the photograph and the subject of the photograph. And I kept asking people, take it like through a window or partially obscured or something, because I think theoretically the author is partly obscured. It's the book that's there for examination, and the author is somewhat distant. So I always wanted that distance in photographs. And the one reflected in the mirror is exactly that. You're not looking directly at me. This is, there is some distancing there. And maybe it's a shyness possibly, or it is I mean, I don't believe like a native tribe that it is in some way stealing my soul, but I do feel to be directly photographed is intrusive, and it is something that I don't enjoy. So it gets around that problem.
And of course, something that you've suffered rather a lot in your second career. And if we had time, I'd ask you about that and about, you know, how many times you think you might have signed your name in your career as Lee Child, but we don't have time. So we'll have to deal with that question another time, unless you've already done that calculation. And I just want to thank you very much for joining me for this discussion, and encourage people to maybe read more stories in the biography. And I want to thank again, the sponsor, Rayward Solicitors and Harrogate International Festivals, for hosting us. And then I'd really like to give the last word to Lee.
Yeah, well, it's been interesting experience being, I don't know what the word is, being biographed. And so thank you for that. And again, yeah, thanks to Harrogate and all the sponsors and all the organizers. Good luck, keep going, and hopefully we'll see you face to face next year.